Yo, Ume here. Today I'd like to share my thoughts and observations about PoE2 and its current state that I've accumulated over the last year of active engagement with PoE2. My intention is to trigger an open discussion with a lot of nuance and detail, while keeping it non-condescending and without any strawmanning, and preferably with as little bias from me as possible, because I think it's important, but most importantly fun. Nevertheless, if, or rather when, I fail to follow those or end up completely wrong in your opinion, please correct me or voice your opinion in the comments below. That being said, the video is split into four categories: balancing gameplay, philosophy, community, and conclusion and suggestions. Time codes are splitting the video into smaller subsections if you're interested in a particular topic, so use the time bar or description for that. Without further ado, let's get into it. Starting off with game balance, bottlenecks. Depending on how closely you follow build guides and the intertwining narrative between them, you may or may not have noticed that 99% of builds boil down to the application and scaling of the exact same few modifiers, or as I called them, bottlenecks. The list of those are crit, plus levels, ES, and key uniques and interactions such as Tangle Tongue, Plague Finger, Blood Barbs, Shotgunning, etc. etc. Two main reasons why crit is so powerful in PoE2 are its outstanding effectiveness on the skill tree compared to other nodes, as well as it affecting and working with nearly every build in the game one way or another. If you look at the skill tree and compare what 10% increased attack damage, or any non-crit damage increase for that instance, and 10% increased critical hit chance, or 15% increased critical damage bonus does to your build numerically, then you'll notice that due to former being additive and latter being multiplicative, the difference is massive. Of course, early on additive damage trumps multiplicative due to lack of cascading multipliers, but very soon the power dynamic between those two goes out of hand. One Mana Left, for example, made a video talking about this and comparing how unsatisfying it feels to take such additive nodes and how PoE1 mitigates both that feeling and the balance crux. On the other hand, you have the fact that crit works on Ailment DoTs, which is a whole nother beast of its own. Let's look at Bleed for instance. In PoE1, it's an ailment that deals 70% base physical damage of the attack while standing still, and 210 if moving, or if aggravated. Speaking of enemy. And has a duration of 5 seconds. Now, if we go to PoE2 Bleed, we instantly notice something very odd. It's 15% pre-mitigation damage, to exclude being affected by armor, with moving or aggravate increasing it to 30. Honestly, as a Bleed one trick, when I saw that for the first time, I was in disbelief. But in retrospective, it makes a lot of sense, because if PoE2 Bleed was nearly as strong as its PoE1 version, going to crit would allow you to effortlessly obliterate the entire game. Poison and Ignite, for example, have a similar problem, although their power curves are shifted through different means, such as Poison having a limit, while Ignite being gated behind flammability, and balanced around guaranteed applications of Ignite. So all in all, it leaves Ailment dot builds in a terrible spot unless you're using incredibly powerful scaling modifiers such as all damage from hits contributes to poison magnitude from Plague Finger, or just going crit. Well, ideally both. That means that Ailment dots are unplayable early, if not throughout the entire campaign, while being forced into a very narrow scaling choice that basically doesn't even exist. Next on the list, plus levels. Thankfully, this one doesn't require a 700 word C2 level essay to explain, since it's pretty straightforward. You get plus 1 level, you get a specific amount of more damage no matter what level you're at, which multiplies with all of your additive and other multiplicative modifiers, and that's it. Universal, cookie clicker, and very powerful. What else could you want? Of course, it comes with a caveat of significantly increasing our mana cost in the long term and when heavily invested, but we'll get to the mana memes later on. Its lack of demand for any sort of setup, such as crit, and relative ease of acquisition makes it a take it or you're dumb type of bottleneck, which is hard to ignore, starting right from the beach. Now, onto the biggest meme of them all, ES. ES is supposed to be this big pool, hard to recover thing that should be on the other side of the spectrum from life, which is seemingly intended to be a small amount, easy to recover. In reality, ES values become so large that they end up stretching throughout the whole spectrum, completely overshadowing life once it gets going. So, let's break it down. 1. Increased ES values are very high compared to 0 increased life nodes in the tree, and if present anywhere else, being 5 to 10 times smaller, like 3%, 5%, 8% increased life on like amulets or jewels. You know what I mean? This is the main reason why endgame life characters have 3 to 5k life, while ES characters can reach absurd numbers of 20k and more. That makes ES excel at max hit values while also matching, if not outmatching life in EHP values as well, due to how effective things like evasion or block become with such big hit pools. 2. ES recovery conditions are lack of interaction compared to life that either drains your resources or investments such as time of need and life fast charges, or requires proactive interaction with enemies such as leech or life on kill. To that, ES recovery is multiplicative with itself, so more ES equals more recovery, which makes it into an exponential beast with 3 different modifiers that multiply each other, being max ES, ES recharge rate, and ES recharge rate delay. And sure, intuitively and in vacuum, none of this covers for its weakness of being hard to recover in combat. But considering the current combat dynamics of where you either one-shot, incapacitate, or both everything on your screen, or just stay 2 screens away, it's not that big of a problem. 3. ES fits any build. Life, not so much. Getting a lot of life is heavily dependent on strength, whether small passive nodes in the tree or gear suffixes, but that's quite an investment, especially if your items and gems don't require much strength, which naturally leads you to the question of, if I don't need strength, why would I huff and puff to barely get myself to 2k life if I can free up those prefixes and suffixes to get 4 times more ES with superior mechanics? The last balance bottleneck that I'd like to cover are mechanics that break the scaling of builds and skills. Shotgunning, crit manipulation, and elemental damage applying to bleed or poison. Of course, that isn't the entire list, but I'd like to keep it short so that we have a grounded example of what is being talked about. This problem is caused equally by certain mechanics as it is by disproportionate power allocated to items, making them have absurd effects. And the problematic part of it is the question of, if it's intended and those things are the way they are by design, then what happens to them if you nerd them or change them? Sure, the surrounded helmet unique might have been an oversight, but everything else seems to be an intended direction of item/node/mechanic design that is so problematic that it either stays this way or disappears completely off the radars after the nerfs or the changes. The next topic on the list is game mechanics being so closely intertwined with each other that it's hard to single out any one of them that fixes or alleviates the problems we're facing. This dilemma is rather simple in articulation, but incredibly complex, if not unsolvable, if attempts to untangle it are made. Okay, so let's say we identify crit as a problem. No matter what we change or nerf about it, it sends rippling effects through the entire game. Ailment DoTs get fucked, late game scaling takes a vacation, Blood Mage suddenly isn't an S tier ascendancy, crit mods on gear become a dead mod, many interesting uniques or gems such as cast on crit are as uninteresting or if not unusable anymore. A glass castle coming down from meddling with a single thread. How do you solve something that is so tightly packed together that each individual part depends on each other to such an extreme extent that removing one of them invalidated preemptive measures taken in cases with others? This whole thing makes PoE2 balance design a very conservative and clumsy ball of thread that seems to either require serious system reworks or to be left alone, both of which are bad scenarios. Moving on to more global and apparent problems of the design, skill tree and items. In my opinion, if you talk about skill tree being boring, you have to mention items, and vice versa, because the dynamic between those two systems seems to be at least partially intentional. The reason I think this way is because from various interviews Jonathan has participated in, and QAs in general of PoE2 announcements, it seems that GGG are trying to make gear acquisition more exciting and central to the core of the game than deterministic means such as skill tree or even semi-deterministic crafting itself. I could speculate as to why for a very long time, but instead I'd like to talk about what it implies. Most of us know that PoE2 skill tree is weak and boring, while items are very powerful and meaningful. Why is that? You can think of it as a tug of war where skill tree and items are a part of the same system. If you want to make one of them more meaningful, you have to weaken the other one in contrast, or you risk causing serious power creep. In my eyes, that's exactly what's happening. The skill tree might just be the way it is by design so that players are more excited about uncertain and far more variable things such as gear, rather than predetermined and somewhat stationary variables such as the skill tree. With this perspective in mind, things like tiered gear, low passive skill node values, vac utility on skill tree, and absurd interactions caused by unique items start to make a lot of sense. If a lot of your power comes from a weapon, why don't you invest into some attack speed during a flash effect on your secondary weapon slot for Whirling Slash? Or get some mana recovery from flasks if you've crit recently in case you can't leech mana? From the eyes of the player, who just wants to kill monsters, this logic might seem stupid, nonsensical, or even restraining, but there's a non-zero chance that this isn't just an argument created through steel manning, but rather an intended and logical approach from perspective of GGG. That being said, I'm not trying to defend their perspective on this or their approach. It's more of a statement of how does it make sense and why are they doing it and how it is a problem where there's a mismatch between perspectives of players and developers. Next up, resource management. Boy, oh boy. You're probably familiar with the memes of Generator Spender that was born in D4 community, but unfortunately, it seems to be prevalent in PoE2 as well, quite literally. If we first look at PoE1 and how things such as mana or valor work, it usually boils down to how self-sufficiently can you sustain it, meaning that instead of finding ways to get the most value out of it, players first and foremost seek to automate it and make it an essential part of their build's identity. Examples like Bloodsoaked Banner, Rage, Mana Leech, Intensity for spells, Corpse Consumption for Necromancer, the list goes on. But in PoE2, such resources become something different from just ways to make your build work. They become requirements for certain interactions that are hard to reach and are supposed to have serious payoff. It's a part of the combo slop gameplay expectation that is put on us as players, but we'll talk about it right after this. For now, I'd like to focus your attention on how things like mana, rage, valor, or buff uptime don't seem like something you can integrate into your build as a core trait, but rather as an optional management minigame that conditionally empowers your character or unlocks certain interactions while being inconsistent in its uptime or requiring very serious investment for the uptime to be consistent. And what's weird about it is that the reality of those resources is very juxtaposed. You either are always at full mana, or you can't cast your Hammer of the Gods because you only have 682 maximum mana instead of the required 773. No way, dude! Okay, sorry. Lock in. There are rarely moments of, damn, my mana is struggling, but I'm fine for now. It's either I'm leeching mana, or I can't get plus level to my Essence Drain, or I can't map. It's one of those reasons why Mana Leech and Atalui's Bloodletting are so powerful and why Mana Flask often becomes either an annoying chore or a dead slot, rarely being something core to your build's identity as it would be for an Archmage. Why did I suddenly bring up Archmage, you might ask? Because with how much focus goes into flasks, mana sustain dilemmas, and skill tree trying to assist you with that, to me it seems like GGG want us to use our mana flasks more like an Archmage rather than a PoE1 build, which is basically not using it at all. And I have no problem with that intent inherently, but the consequences of that goal make mana and bright proliferation other resources either a pain in the ass that you have to constantly manage or spend a sizable amount of your power budget on, or generate so trivially that you forget it exists, such as Rage for melee. Following that is the mismatch between monster and player behavior. Do you remember those memes about white monsters having it as good as we the players have it in PoE1? Yeah, this is going to be about that, but with a little bit more nuance. This is a complicated problem with many variables, so let's unravel it one by one. Monsters often swarm you and punish you for lack of immediate response, or in other words, monster behavior is burst-oriented or front-loaded. Players are alone, easily stunned, relatively low movement speed, and have less uptime, or in other words, player behavior is combo-oriented or backloaded. This mismatch causes players to either A, play very slowly, trying to stay under the speed ceiling to not be punished, or B, opt into burst or burst mitigation oriented mechanics, skills, builds to bypass the punishment and bridge the gap. Now, if you think about case B, what comes to mind? Probably crit, coverage, freezer stun, temp chains, ES, Pathfinder. All of those are build choices or mechanics that either allow you to match the bursty nature of the game or to ignore it altogether. Whether it being able to sprint carelessly, having 22k energy shield to not die from being surrounded, or slow enemies to such an extent that you might as well be playing Grandma Eternal, fighting off hordes of angry people trying to scold you for being a lazy generation for not being able to afford a headhunter because you're not working hard enough. But the implications don't stop there. The game tries to incentivize you to use combos of skills, but even if you are using some of the tempo gap mitigating mechanics, let's say temp chains, you're still going to struggle to do that unless you're in a Giga endgame, or if that particular interaction has certain properties such as allowing you to keep moving, being unconditional, or having CC in its core kit. Yeah, I'm looking at you, Whirling Slash. This means that the gap between someone who tries to play by the rules and someone who bypasses them is astronomical, which, for example, makes the gap between okay builds and good builds even bigger than it usually is. All of this neatly ties into the next topic, the game controlling the speed at which you play. In general, this problem boils down to the following sentence. Hitting PoE1 ceiling is a skill issue. Hitting PoE2 ceiling is a management and patience issue. PoE2 puts heavy restrictions on the levels of limit testing you can do and the surrounding variables that you can affect to extend that limit. Whether it's monsters surrounding you, sprint being hardly usable in combat scenarios, zones with narrow passages, being swarmed which prompts more careful gameplay, maim, hinder, chill, and temp chains, lack of movement skills, and dependency on waypoints, especially in campaign. All of those factors are mostly friction that isn't something you can overcome by being better, but are something you can avoid or alleviate by being patient or managing your character better, which usually is a thing only in the endgame. So ultimately, what ends up happening is that players are being restrained gameplay-wise to play accordingly to the set, not necessarily intended, speed of the game that is determined by its zones, monsters, frequency of debilitating effects, and mismatch in expectations from the player and reality of monsters, making for an annoying experience of rarely, if ever, being ahead of the curve and seeing how your character progression is handheld by the surrounding design. This marks the end of the balance and gameplay section of the video and the beginning of the discussion about design philosophy of PoE2. What is the first thing you encounter when you start playing PoE2? Campaign. In my eyes, the campaign in modern ARPGs is a mix of tutorial and a guided experience that is supposed to guide you to a more sandboxy experience that is endgame. And intuitively, that experience, if repeated, will be at the very least boring, if not unpleasant. Well, GGG set out to change that by trying to make the campaign more engaging and interesting to do. So let's talk about it from the philosophy standpoint, since there isn't much to discuss about it from the reality standpoint, except for it just being unpleasant, annoying, and confusing. A good parallel to draw here is homework. Most people don't like homework, unless you are particularly interested in the subject. And many people also think that homework is the core of the problem, that by removing it, they'll fix the issue at hand. But that isn't really true. The existence of homework isn't what triggers the resistance, it's the lack of interest in the subject associated with the homework. So what could theoretically be done instead is significant modifications to the homework system to incentivize students to do it while making it engaging. And that is exactly the route GGG are intending to take. But it has a major flaw. If someone doesn't like something, you can't make them not dislike it by modifying the same phenomena they experience distaste towards. In other words, if someone doesn't like campaign and is here just for the endgame, no amount of modifications to it will make them stop disliking it. Just like modifications to the homework process won't change little Timmy's interest in history of Glubleiger Prumpastor, the 17th Emperor of Madagascarian province. So all in all, I think that GGG are fighting in the wrong direction. That makes sense. Not to say that allowing players to skip campaign is better, but rather that if their rhetoric in regards to improvement of the campaign is about helping with the stakes towards it, then it's more of a stalemate than moving towards victory. But who knows? Maybe that's exactly what they want. Or maybe the campaign improvements are catered towards the new players instead of the consistent ones. Could be either. So, GGG have stated on multiple occasions that they want PoE2 to be more accessible than PoE1 while keeping the complexity intact. That is a very complicated goal to achieve and status to uphold, but not impossible nevertheless. There are rare examples of games that are capable of lowering their entry floor to a very approachable level while keeping the ceiling incredibly high. Examples that I know of would be Osu, Chess, and Tetris. Can't really think of anything else. Do you notice any similarities between these three? All of them are about visibly restricted width of gameplay while having immense depth of mastery. And that's not something bad by any means, but if we go back to GGG intending to make PoE2 into something accessible and complex, then it all starts to break down because simplicity is often accompanied by either lack of weight in singular choices or by presence of serious restrictions. And I believe that PoE2 is an example of serious restrictions, because wherever you go, you see you cannot, on every corner of gameplay and mechanics. But it gets worse. PoE2 has a lot of handholding with recommended gems, intended skill interactions, and severely gated access to skills and support gems. All in all, seemingly good intentions backfire on PoE2 from all fronts, making it an exchange of width for a broader appeal. But is it really worth it? From this stems another unpleasant property of PoE2. There seems to be an intended pace of character progression, not just gameplay itself. We don't know what it is because GGG are avoiding to set and manage players' expectations for both good and bad reasons, we'll talk about later. But what it does seem hinting towards is a question of what if PoE2 is restrictive solely for the purpose of broader appeal? If you've played PoE2 for any decent amount of time, you've probably noticed how everything unrelated to gameplay is 10 out of 10. Music, ambient, environment, lore, lighting, dialogue, voice actor work. But why? That's the question that was spinning in my mind ever since 0.1, and I'd like to present you my most plausible explanation. PoE2 is built from top to bottom instead of the usual bottom to top. What I mean by that is that the world of PoE2 with all of its details came before the gameplay. That art came before skills. Music came before combat pacing. That lore came before balance. But why is that? Well, PoE2 was initially a big update for PoE1, but once they reframed the scope, they had to rebuild the game from beneath all the fancy work they've done for the game that is in gameplay, which is why there's such a significant mismatch in quality between those two. To support that, if you look at the gameplay of the early trailers, you can see that underneath it all, it's PoE1 that looks like PoE2, but somewhere after that, the scope was reframed. That makes gameplay aspect lag way behind everything else, creating an unpleasant dichotomy between mechanical and perceptual experiences, while also being a spark for conflict between new or casual audience and established or veteran audience of ARPG sector. Adding to the narrative of chaotic development, in the latest interview Jonathan participated in with Legendary Drops, he mentioned that currently he's looking towards the next thing instead of having long-term plans about PoE2. While not judging him for it, I do want to point out that presence and persistence of some of the issues that are plaguing PoE2, even the aforementioned dissonance between gameplay and everything else, could be caused by chaotic and short-sighted development approach, making for a very inconsistent development which feeds into unnecessary bloat with runes, whack supports, and uniques, while also lacking a set direction for the game. Because of that, and this is something that can be affected by a lot of bias from me, the game feels like it's being grown instead of built, where it expands into quote unquote random directions, which is exacerbated by its likely backwards development and makes some of the additions not useless, but let's say pointless and without a grander overarching narrative or goal. This is another spark for conflict between communities, because most games aren't made like that. For that reason, it might be that PoE1 community, being used to a more structured process of changes, are having an allergy to the hectic and freestyle development of PoE2, while the more casual player base really likes it due to its rarity and curiosity that rises from its unpredictability. Because after all, we, and by we I mean PoE1 players, have gotten used to planning out stuff, or at least being able to, so it makes sense that naturally would have a hard time getting used to this kind of style. It is apparent that PoE2 is heavily influenced by Souls-likes and Elden Ring, especially if you consider that Jonathan is a big fan of Elden Ring, and it makes sense for a developer to look at other games, especially the ones they like, and try to iterate on or outright add things from that game to the one they're making. Besides, GG has been doing that for years with league mechanics, so why not take it a step higher and do it with the entirety of the game? Mixing game genres isn't necessarily bad, but depending on how you execute it, the final product can vary significantly. I think that PoE2 is a case of an unelegant mixing of genres, where mismatching properties are being mixed together for a very weird and foolish mix of gameplay loop, mechanics, and expectations from the player. That being said, PoE2 is not a Souls-like, not even close. Despite my previously mentioned intent of not being condescending, I must make an exception here and now. If you think that PoE2 is a Souls-like in any manner or capacity, you either haven't really played any Souls-like games, or you simply have no understanding of underlying game design, making you unable to draw lines between design decisions. Going back to PoE, basically, PoE2 ends up trying to be somewhat like Elden Ring, but fails in most aspects. What's interesting though is that the way majority of players perceive Elden Ring is the same way people perceive PoE2, as in they value it for the upfront and surface level experience, while ignoring underlying gameplay issues that reveal themselves only with previous experience, deliberate attention, and tryharding. Another pain point that is heavily based on experience and perspective is friction and difficulty. As you may know, the way we perceive things isn't always the same way things are, and yet our brains are capable of treating the perception as something real and release hormones and neurotransmitters based on that deliberate reality. PoE2 has a lot of friction, basically everywhere. If anything, it's on the completely opposite side of the spectrum that TLI is. For those who don't know, Torchlight Infinite. And TLI is a good anchor point to compare how neurochemistry and perception affects our opinions on things, even if those things are overboard. TLI has as little friction as possible in almost every aspect, and there are people that enjoy it a lot because they can turn off their brain and click buttons. While PoE2 is the opposite, where you have to be constantly present and exert 120% of effort to get 100% of results. And most importantly, both games are enjoyed, but by different groups of people with different perceptions. So here's my question, my theory. If we keep in mind that perception can dictate our reaction and feelings, then could it be that the way TLI enjoyers mistake engagement for fun, or in other words, pure dopamine for having a good time, is the same way how PoE2 enjoyers mistake friction for difficulty, or in other words, annoyance for accomplishment? The main reason I'm bringing this up is to show how even if you hate PoE2, you're still vulnerable and likely falling for the same mechanisms which cause people to enjoy PoE2 and ignore all the problems that it has. So this then means that the mismatch of perception is not only caused by incompetence, but our inherent human properties that all of us possess. And that, ultimately, means that before we try to prove someone wrong, we should first seek to cleanse ourselves of possible biases before proceeding to engage in meaningful, or not, conversations about the state of the game. Damn, I kind of got carried a little away in this one philosophically, but I hope this is fine. Building upon the perception discussion, what I believe to be critical as a game developer is setting and managing expectations of your players, where setting expectations would be like saying what is normal and what isn't, while managing expectations is influencing the current status quo of expectations in regards to certain things. Depending on the approach, either of them can be performed or not performed, meaning neither of those things are inherently bad or good. And yet, the biggest problems arise in two scenarios: too much managing and too little. In GGG's case, it's the latter. I personally still sometimes can't believe that the game we play speaks to us about expectations 10 times louder than developers. And I don't necessarily judge them for not wanting to sway the public perception or expectations in a direction that they have to deviate from later, but such lack of structure and communication about intent is making everything very hectic, to a point where players have not only to draw their own conclusions with lackluster understanding of game design, psychology, and in some cases philosophy, but also receive conflicting signals from developers based on their actions simply because we don't understand the context under which GGG operates, making it hard to consistently understand them, even if you disagree, without immense amount of gaslighting, delusion, or coping. Alright, that is it for the philosophy aspect of the discussion. Still stay in exile? Next, we have the community aspect, which is mostly about observations and relationships we're forming or have already formed with each other, whether it's about content creators, active community members, or just players. One of the biggest red flags that I've mentioned previously a few times is the clash of communities, of player types, of players and content creators, whatever Marxism adjacent theory you like. From what I've noticed, if you boil it down to very simple terms, then the conflict is expectations versus contentness. And I really want to emphasize how neither of those is better than the other, because again, both are flawed. Expectations usually arise from more diehard and knowledgeable people, but has serious emotional charge and implies certain levels of conservatism in regards to quality. Contentedness, on the other hand, is the property of more casual and new player base, who often lack competence or time to care about such things, causing them to be more accepting of the status quo, making anything beyond that a big bonus. PoE2 obviously favors the latter community far more, which is part of the reason why the brewing conflict is so heated. Casuals think that the diehards are morons, the ones who zoom at 1000 movement speed and drop 15 awakened mirrors of Calandra, while veterans lose their shit over lack of nuance and understanding from the casuals, shitting on them ruthlessly and calling them names such as tourists. Neither side is right, and neither side seems to be interested in understanding the other, which to me is kind of sad. Because after all, we're all just potatoes in the same bowl, even if some of us want to become French fries and the others want to become a puree. And what's worse is that this tension backfires on both camps, meaning that the longer this lasts, the more serious the consequences will be for either side. What consequences, you may ask? At best, strictly patrolled echo chambers, not a good thing, but manageable. And at worst, people leaving the game due to how heated and split the community is. In my eyes, both are undesirable, even if both are already happening. And, somewhere out there is an idealistic world where we move away from these detrimental edge case scenarios by trying to understand each other, talking, and, content creators joining in on this. But that's just hopes and dreams. Talking specifically about content creators, with PoE2 release, a social vacuum has been created that has been filled by either new or re-emerging faces. I like to focus on the former, the new faces. A fresh start can be a new chance to prove yourself by cleansing yourself of the past sins, or just filling a certain niche, or in some cases, simply being able to have those sins hidden and take the advantage of the fresh audience to become someone you couldn't do to your past that still defines you. And so, over the last year, I have observed an interesting dynamic of how PoE2 content creators could emerge and solidify in the sphere only if they match the open-minded, help-oriented mindset like the most of the PoE1 community. Otherwise, they are met with serious scrutiny and eventually crumble under the pressure of revealing who they actually are, be it frauds or jackasses. In PoE1's long history, that has happened a lot, meaning that those who have been there to witness it have trained their eye well to spot such cases from a mile away. For that reason, there are some content creators that are facing side-eyed looks from the experienced community while still being watched and enjoyed by the more new and less experienced audience. One such example is the recent drama with Guy That Dies. I personally don't have anything against him, despite some of his questionable behavior and takes, and at the same time, I do not endorse bullying that is expressed by some people towards him. To me, it is simply an interesting case of how pre-established rules and norms of behavior can not only transfer between communities, but also affect the development of the newly formed community by affecting who gets to be respected and who doesn't. I hope that this and possibly following situations won't become a warning sign that PoE1 community is toxic, but more of a lesson that there are standards to which you should uphold yourself if you are to become a part of either PoE1's or PoE2's community. So, to finish this massive 5,590 word docran essay, I'd like to discuss some overarching topics as well as discuss some of the things that GGG could do in order to sway the game in a better direction without changing its personality entirely. Are we the prisoners of our expectations, or do our expectations lead us to what is right? Expectations are defined by our experiences, and yet expectations limit the types of experiences we're open to. So perhaps it is best for both sides to try to reframe their own expectations, whether it is to each other or to the games, or ideally rid themselves of it to see what's in front of them from a new angle. It doesn't mean that you will suddenly start liking getting heavy stunned when sprinting, or that GGG will suddenly become devil incarnates that don't know what they're doing when it comes to games balance. But fresh experiences are always important if you truly care about truth, and not just looking at the picture through a keyhole. Is PoE1 too outdated to compete with PoE2? Some PoE2 frogs claim that GGG should stop supporting PoE1 because it's an insanely old game and PoE2 is already better, so they should pour all the resources into it. Instead of addressing it directly, like most people would, I would like to highlight some of the implications and inconsistencies that are present. Getting rid of something old just because it's old is a common symptom of consumerism that has spread like a cognitive plague through our minds in the last few centuries. Based on that, We should get rid of all people above 50, change apartments or houses every few years, delete movies that were filmed before 2005, and don't have toys or items from our childhood for nostalgia purpose, while heavily criticizing nostalgia itself. None of that would make sense, right? To that, there's been a serious shift in media perception over the last few years where everything is being compared to each other to a point where it becomes a thief of joy. There is no need to determine whether PoE1 or PoE2 is better, for it is an absolutely worthless question to answer. There's no benefit, there's no higher truth to be revealed or peace to be instilled. The only thing that matters is which one you like the most. Better or not, doesn't matter. Not a single person on earth always likes the best thing, right? So why would it be a crime in this particular case to like PoE2 if it's worse, or PoE1 if it's worse? Is PoE2 too young to compete with PoE1? I would say no. PoE2 being in an open beta is not the deciding factor in whether or not it can win over some of the people, because one of its main goals is to be made for a broader audience, for a different kind of audience. People often think that having a bigger pie is better than having two different types of pies, and yet if you think about it from the perspective of a person that doesn't like that singular pie, wouldn't it be better to have two different ones in order to cover the blind spot of the previous pie? What I'm getting at is that PoE2's main advantage over PoE1 is not that it's younger, or has more devs working, or has better art or animations. It's that it's different. The devs can make decisions different from PoE1, ones that they couldn't have made there without serious consequences, whether it's just learning and iterating or discovering new properties that can be enjoyed and cannot be discovered in PoE1, doesn't matter. We might not naturally like different, but sometimes different alone is good than same. What should GGG do in all of this? As stated by Jonathan, they are relearning how to and what it takes to make a game from scratch. So I'd say give them time. Maybe a lot of time. And I'm not saying to lower your expectations or to stop the criticism. Just accept that this is something they aren't all too good at and that they need to time to learn and adapt. For context, I'm a big crybaby and whiner when it comes to infuriating PoE2 stuff, and yet I still try to ground myself and have a rational perspective on all of it, even if it's stupid, improper, or whatever. And going back to what I said previously, I do think that understanding each other and being patient is far more important than throwing rocks at each other as soon as we don't like something or we think that someone is stupid. When it comes to what GGG should do in regards to the problems listed above, here's what I think. 1. Decouple crit damage and ailment damage. Make critical strikes with ailments do something special, be it prolif and ignoring resistances for ignite, bypassing the limit with significantly reduced duration for poison, or creation of boiling blood beneath the struck enemies for bleeding. This way GGG can gain more freedom in balancing those, while diving deeper into their uniqueness and maintaining the presence of crit and ailment combos. 2. Make ES builds about recharge, not hit pool. In my opinion, the only thing that makes sense is to make ES more about investments into its recharge rate and delay by decreasing the amount of percent ES on the tree while adding recharge rate and delay reduction onto the same nodes, making it more similar to Ward in PoE1, where it's hard to get high numbers, but it still works as a decent protection against hits. Also, remove any ES leech. This will drastically shift the power dynamic of defensive layers and will definitely hit Monk, Ranger, and Hunters the most, which is why... 3. Change Ghost Dance to also give a small amount of total evasion as flat ES, while making Wind Dancer give a stacking percent chance to deflect based on evasion. Who knows, maybe even add a third Dancer that does the same thing but with elemental resistances or armor. But that would require making them exclusive and unusable together, otherwise it could and probably would skyrocket evasion builds a bit too high. 4. Change the plus level formula to favor attack slightly more than it does currently, while making the general formula more front-loaded, so that, for example, getting plus 3 levels becomes more rewarding than it currently is, but getting plus 10 levels is less rewarding than it currently is, allowing for more low play rate skills to take advantage of it, while also not allowing the S-tier skills to take such an advantage of it. 5. Make cast-on meta skills into utility automation rather than damage output automation. Now, I know, this might sound cooked, but let me present it first. As we discussed earlier, GGG really want us to generate and spend, while not wanting us to easily automate certain stuff. For that reason, cast-on skills died in what was it, 0.1, 0.2? So What if instead they made sure that those things won't allow you to deal any meaningful damage, but it will make it easier to use utility skills such as curses, marks, or applying stuff like chill or shock by reducing the mana cost of the triggering skill in return for lower damage output? 6. Add reverse far shot and point blank for melee/close range builds. What I mean by that is to add gems, reservation skills, or even valor adjacent buffs that would make you take less damage depending on the distance from the enemy, based on your choice. Of course, this could be used by non-melee ascendancies, but I think that such a mechanic would benefit melee the most, especially if your build either lacks range or puts you into risky situations where you're surrounded. I am aware that such a mechanic could cause melee to become extremely OP due to raised shield, or at least make other builds use it in weapon swap for dicey situations or just straight up boss fights. So what could be done to mitigate that is disabling the mechanic whenever you raise shield. Unelegant? Maybe, but it'll work. 7. Allow parry to be used proactively as well. Parry is strong, but it's meh to use. So what if we had some sort of skill that would allow us to leap onto an enemy and force a parry at the cost of still being able to take damage from them? If it was something like jump onto an enemy, into parry, into take some damage, into leap backwards, into do whatever you wanted to do, then it could incentivize a more interesting and proactive gameplay that people would like to engage more with than just AFK standing and waiting for an attack. Such a mechanic doesn't have to be parry specifically. Maybe it could be called, I don't know, weak point, and trigger the same effect as parry does if you critically strike an enemy that has weak point on them, but wouldn't provide the massive damage increase taken. 8. Add item PD quests to acts akin runes or charms. We've all been there. You're in Act 3, you got your ass blasted by the RNG, and you have 0+1 to the spell you're playing. Or the same thing with the weapon, be it bow or spear. Sure, such things happen way more rarely for experienced players that use all of their resources efficiently, but it still happens even to them. So what if there were side quests, akin Tidal Island in Act 6 of PoE1, where you could go get a mediocre spear, or just a low-level wand with +1 to all spells, when by that time you should have already had it. The same could theoretically be done with 10% MS boots +1 resistance also somewhere in Act 3 or end of Act 2. This would set a threshold for what is bad in the campaign, allowing for a more smooth progression even if you get extremely unlucky. 9. Switch campaign monster scaling and endgame scaling around. What bothers me is that in campaign, the monsters almost always match you, if not outclass you in power, to a point where you never really feel strong. Be it a power spike or general feeling of being ahead, well, at the same time, in the endgame, getting from tier 1 to tier 15 is a joke. No red map wall, like in PoE1, no steep scaling of monsters, just Giga chill. Why? 10. Add more support to the combo playstyle. GGG wants us to combo? Fine, but show us it's worth it. And I'm not talking about the cookie clicker whirling slash plus twisters or snipe plus frozen Dambassery. I mean combining skills that don't have an inherently written line about their interaction but can still work together. Something like fire skills used within Orb of Storms apply 50% more flammability, or attacks used near a shockwave totem break armor equal to the 25% of physical hit damage dealt. This way, even the clunky and stupid skills like Shockwave Totem can get transformed into something really cool and game-changing. 11. Make sprint have a grace period in the first 1 to 2 seconds of sprinting, or make enemies knock us down only on second hit during a consecutive sprint. Or alternatively, make the presence or absence of knockdown depend on the strength of the hit. This way, people would get still punished, but it would be less annoying and perhaps more skill dependent when it comes to in-combat or combat-adjacent situations. Sure, sprint sucks, I agree, but I highly doubt that GGG would just go and give everyone movement speed to compensate for the removal of sprint, which is why this is my proposal. 12. Remove life to mana and mana to life mods on flasks. Nobody likes them. It breaks your flask and you're inflicted with critical sadness debuff for the next 3 minutes. 13. GGG should make a stand on mana and other resources. GGG need to figure out what they want such resources to be. For now, it seems like it's all over the place, to a point that while some people struggle sending mana or buff up times, others didn't even know it was a problem. Such polarities create unpleasant uncertainty and gravitational pull towards the most automatic and seamless interactions. 14. Make basic skills and unique skills get a 6 link at level 18 or 19, not 20. Do you know how rare level 20 skills from uniques are? So rare that you might farm a certain boss the entire league for tens, if not hundreds of times and never see it, so you end up having to use a 5-link version instead of a 6-link one, and there's nothing you can do. Other option is to add a currency that would allow you to level up the inherent skill of a unique item so that this wouldn't be a problem. Sure, the price and its usage would be gated behind using it on level 18 and 19 skills, but it'd be sure as hell better than nothing. 15. Stop nuking every build of the week. Public executions might be fun if we were in the 13th century, but it's just no fun at all for anyone. Feels either like a Black Friday for those who are interested in it, or '07 Buddy Parade for those who aren't. 16. Significantly reduce the frequency of debilitating effects in non-rare maps in campaign. There are no ways to combat it most of the time, like maim, chill, or hinder, and it's especially prevalent in the campaign. So why the hell is it so common? 17. Make Ultimatum less RNG and sluggish. Everyone hates Ultimatum. My homies hate Ultimatum. Hell, I even once complained about Ultimatum to my mom during 0.3, and even she hates it now. Real story, by the way. The way this could be implemented is splitting mods into minor and major. Oh my god, just like in Trials of Sekima. Making it so that you have to pick a major modifier only every 3 or 4 rooms, while the previous rooms are always minor modifiers. To that, reducing the amount of time in the mob spawning room, while gradually increasing the speed of the payload the longer you stayed in its proximity, could help drastically with the boring parts. 18. Act 3 difficulty spike is something else. Unless you're an OP build, you can really feel that mobs get tankier and there's far more of them. Pick one, please. To that, for some reason, Act 3 introduces by far the most unpleasant zones in the whole campaign. Azak Bog, Venom Crypts, Matland Waterways, Udzal, and Black Chambers. I understand that Udzal and Black Chambers furrow the difficulty increase by the end of the act, but dear me, what a desperately boring slog. 19. Sidequest RNG. You've probably been there when you get to the Valley of Titans, but one of the medallions is missing. So you go backtrack to whatever zone and farm it 30 minutes just to go back and insert it, or the Sacrificial Heart, or the Chapel Key. All of those things are very annoying and break the flow of the game when you realize that the reason you didn't get them is simply RNG. The solution is simple. Make them drop from a certain boss, or be in a dedicated room/location. 20. Make the guaranteed rewards from side quests worth it. Be it Lazuli Ring versus Iron Ring, the Hanging Tree giving you cast speed rings sometimes, the Keth Amulet underground place where you can get both Stellar Amulet and a Mana Regen one. The difference, especially for the first and the third ones, is massive between high roll and low roll. If it could be a choice like with rings in the underground Keth zone, or at least always attribute amulet, then it'd be far, far better. 21. Armor is too good early, to a point where even non-strength characters are highly incentivized to use it. Maybe that's intended, I don't know, but raising the amount of ES and especially evasion you get on bases during Act 1 and early Act 2 might help a lot with that. 22. Temp chains and chill/freeze are too strong, so please, give enemies delay before they start sprinting at you. Simple as. 23. People love stacking, so stop hard capping or nuking it instead of adjusting the underlying issues. It's like postponing your project until it's 6 hours left and you haven't properly slept today. This just makes the choice and game design far more restrictive and boring. So if the attack speed per accuracy node in the tree didn't have a cap, for example, but instead would get nerfed, then there would still be meaningful choice to be made as to whether or not it's worth padding there. 24. Make reduced skill effect duration only affect active skills, or introduce a hard cap for passive/reservation skills of 50%, so that using less duration for dancer skills stays untouched, but the abuse case scenarios get nuked. 25. Skills that allow you to move while they're in use, such as Whirling Assault or Whirling Slash, should not have knockback. I get it, it's wind skills, wind blow enemies push, but it gives them too much flexibility, and removing that instead of nerfing them might bring them more in line with other skills than just making them deal less damage. Of course, there's a high likelihood that I've forgotten something, but I'm pretty sure I've mentioned most of the things that I had decent opinions on and that are serious present problems in PoE2. But if I did miss something, I'll try to include it in the pinned comment below. Thank you for joining me today. I hope you had fun, and I'll see you in the comments below. Peace and compassion, exiles.